Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today, where we're going to be delving into the key changes introduced in the TIA-942-C standard. My name is Dean Coetzee. I'm EPI's COO, and I'll be your host for today. In the first segment, we're going to discuss the core changes across the various domains, which include telecommunications, architecture, and the new electrical and mechanical requirements. We're then going to move on to the second segment, which is where we're going to help demystify the certification process for data centers. So we're going to provide some insights for you into the upgrade path for data centers that currently hold the TIA-942-B certification. And then finally, we're going to wrap up by discussing the TIA-942 training options, which have been tailored specifically for professionals who are seeking to attain their certifications according to the TIA-942-C standard 2. So we're joined today by Ms. Paige Fong. She's EPI's Global Head of Marketing. She was also responsible for coordinating this webinar today. And we're also joined by Mr. Edward Van Lient, who is EPI's CEO and Chairman. Edward's going to be presenting to you today. Now, Edward's career in the data center industry spans about 37 years, and he's renowned for his dynamic approach and leadership. He's been the driving force behind EPI's evolution from a UK-based entity into the global powerhouse it is today. Despite the demands of his role, though, Edward is, consistently dedicating time to customers, and he still personally oversees a lot of data center audits. He's actually still very hands-on, and that not only underscores his dedication to quality, but it keeps him finely attuned to customer requirements and industry changes. His is a perspective, I think, that's very grounded in practical and real-world insights, and he'll be able to provide you with good oversight today. Beyond that, Edward's actively contributing to the various industry groups. He also holds positions on multiple standards committees, including the influential TR42 committee, which is actually responsible for maintaining the anti-TI-942 standard. So before we jump over and hand over to Edward, I think just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll be running a Q&A after the webinar. We expect that the presentation should go for 30 to 40 minutes. If we don't get to any questions today, please feel free to contact us afterwards. If you could, please post them into the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom screen. It will be difficult for us to keep on top of any questions that are posted into the chat box, simply because we've got so many people who've joined the webinar today. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Edward.
Well, thank you very much, Dean, and welcome everybody to this webinar where we are going to highlight some of the key changes in the TI-942-C. And given the amount of people that have actually registered for the webinar, it's clearly on top of everybody's mind, and I think it has been, long awaited, so to speak. So welcome again, and let's have a look at the agenda. As Dean said already, we're going to delve into the details of some of the changes, but for those of you who might not have come across EPI yet, we'll give you a 1-minute quick overview of who we are and what we do. Then, of course, we're going through the actual TIA standard and its changes. We'll talk also about the certification and updates to certifications for those who already have a data center certified. And as Dean also indicated, we'll talk a bit about the training options and upgrade paths for those that are already certified. And then, of course, you open the floor. To those of you who might have questions, as Dean said, please post them in the Q&A box of this Zoom session instead of the chat. Okay. Well, let me go here. Okay, let's talk about EPI. Originally from the UK, it started in 1987, so we are 37 years old this year. But we moved the headquarters into Singapore, which is still our headquarters here worldwide, and that was done in 1999. And we spanning the whole globe through a large partner network, which are supported by our offices that we have in the various time zones. So what is our mission statement? Very simple: protecting your interest. And we've been doing that already for 37 years. And how do we do that? Well, in our view, it's very simple. Data centers are in the trust business because your customers, whether it's an internal or an external customer, do trust that you take care of their data, make sure that it's secure, make sure that it's available as and when they need it. And in EPI, we always say you need to have 3 things under control. We call them the 3 Ps. That is the product, which is obviously the data center itself, needs to be well designed. We need to make sure that we have proper processes in place. And of course, we need to have competent people. And that is what EPI has basically taken at the heart when we started building our service portfolio to serve the data center industry. So we have a set of services around the data center product itself, the data center for assessment, audit, and certification based on standards like the TIA-942-C, but also on other standards like the EN 5600 and the ISO 22237. Operations, very important because you can have the best building in the world, but obviously you need to have it operated properly with proper governance and processes. And that is all based on the DQS. Again, we do run books, we do assessments, audit, and certification. And of course, you have also a wide range of training, making sure that people have the right skills and competences to operate the data center and manage it. We're quite well known in the market, I would say, having received various awards and been, instrumental in some of the key events around the world, as well as in a wide variety of publications. So let's talk about the 942. First, a little bit about the life cycle. Yeah, the data center life cycle, we all know, but the life cycle for T8, not everybody's familiar with. And it started very early in 2001. That is where the group of people came together to start working on the TA. And the first official standard was published in 2005. Since then, we have a couple of revisions done, including what is currently the version, the TIA-942-B, which was released in July 2017. And since then, we have been working on the new version, the 942-C. The technical committee has approved it a couple of weeks ago. So now we are very busy to get everything up and running in terms of TA is pushing it through the NC process. And it is expected to hit the market in April of this year. So it's very, very soon. So what are some of the changes? Well, from a general perspective, there are some structural changes within the document itself. There are some extra clarifications done, and there are a variety of annexes that are renumbered. So some of them you see here. And some of those annexes, which were informative, so they were supporting the standard, have now also moved into what we call a normative part of the standard. So now they are an instrumental part of the actual requirements of the standard. Some of the other annexes have still remained to be informative, so they provide good guidelines and information for you when you start considering building a data center based on the 942 standard. Now, a very important change is this one, the rating table, which is indicating the requirements for power, electrical, mechanical, architecture, has moved from the informative section into a formative section when you are evaluating data centers based on the well-known rating system. So most data centers have used that in that way already, but since the widespread popularity, it has now moved into an integral part of the formative part of the standard. So in the formative part, so in the rating table, we basically talk about 4 different ratings. Rated 1 being a basic data center, single path for the cooling, electrical, and telecommunication. Obviously not a bad data center, but it serves a purpose only for non-critical environments. Rated 2, where we start having extra components. So now we have at least some capability for potentially a fault or for maintenance. But most of the data centers are in the rated 4 and rated 3 categories, whereby rated 3 is a concurrently maintainable data center, so we can undertake any form of maintenance that is planned without causing any interruption to the mission critical IT. And we have also the rated 4, which is a fault-tolerant data center, which is the data center that can withstand a single fault at any time. And that, of course, without disturbing the IT. So what has been done, because there was sometimes a bit confusion, what are the real requirements behind concurrent maintainable and fault tolerant? So the committee of TIA has worked hard on extending the descriptions to also include a more elaborate statement about what needs to be done from a safety point of view, from a testing point of view, how you need to isolate, and of course also very important that whenever concurrent maintainable work is being performed, that the workplace is still safe. And the same has been done for fault tolerant, because most of the time customers thought that as long as I have 2 active feeds, then I am fault tolerant. So there has been some clarification given as well in terms of what is expected in terms of automation. Yeah, so basically in a fault tolerant data center, we expect that a fault is automatically detected, it's automatically isolated, and there is an automated continuous operation of the data center environment. There are some other things that have been changed, and that is again because of what is happening in the market. For example, we always talked about the generator, typically a standby generator, although in some cases we use a continuous. And since we now not just rely on generators anymore as a standby power, because now we could have massive batteries, we could have hydrogen installations, etc. So the terminology has now changed to what we call a standby power system. So to accommodate that, data centers also might go for non-genset style type of backup plants. For air conditioning, we now start talking about heat removal, and of course that has to do with systems based on, for example, immersion cooling and cold plate cooling, etc. Water leak is now more general, called liquid, and CCTV, a pretty old term which everybody's familiar with, is moving now to what we call the VSS, so video surveillance system. Excuse me. So what are some of the key changes? Well, one of the overall key changes is that we now have also taken a more risk-based type of approach. So rather than specifying hard numbers like you need to be X kilometers away from a certain risk zone, we now have specified that it's based on risk analysis, which gives the designers and builders, of course, more opportunity to place data centers in a safe zone. The micro DC, the micro edge data center, is now also an integral part of the TIA-942 standard. And basically it is a wide description, including also the handy table where the various requirements are listed. Now be aware that for the micro DC, we don't talk about rated 1, 2, 3, 4. We are talking about two types only. So we have a type A and a type B. Whereby type A is based on a kind of like a virtual type of availability session. So basically you could have multiple edge data centers that work together as one with, for example, overlapping cell capability, etc. Whereby the type B is a little bit more traditional, where most of the resiliency is built within the edge DC itself by means of, for example, dual power supply, etc., etc. Of course, everybody talks about green. Sustainability is high on the list of many data center design and builders, and therefore TA also has added some descriptions around energy efficiency. And most of the references are being made to the good old ISO 30134, which lists the key performance indicators for data centers. And you're all familiar probably with the good old PUE, WE, CUE, etc. So let's dive into some of the specific changes in each of the categories. As you know, the TIA basically splits the standard in 4 portions: the telecommunications, the architecture, electrical, and mechanical sections. So let's go through some of those individually. For telecom, single balance twisted pair has been added as a cabling type, and that is based on the TIA 568.5, which has been released. And we also have made it now mandatory for the categorized 6 to be performed or to be installed when you are running wireless. For optical connectors, again, we refer to the 568.3 for anything that is related to equipment outlets. But the good old LC and MPO connectors are still required for the fiber section in the EOS. And there are some extra recommendations now to build up more redundancy on the horizontal and backbone cabling by requiring 2 optical fibers. Quite a substantial change, I would say, is for the racks in the MDA, IDA, and HDA. Traditionally, that was the traditional 19-inch rack, has 600 mm wide, which has now increased to 800. And that has to do, of course, with the additional cabling that is nowadays coming in. Cable value rating normally differs already kind of indicated by the local regulations, but now it also has been clearly indicated that you need plenum rated or LCSP, LZH type of cabling. And that, of course, all depends on the applications. Typically, this is applicable if you have cabling in, under the raised floor, suspended ceiling areas, etc., etc. And there are some recommendations for ultra low latency networks, which again becomes more and more critical now, especially when we're talking about 5G, AI, etc. From an architectural point of view, as I mentioned, it is now more risk-based. So one of the key things that was always debated was the flight path. In the traditional previous versions of the 942, where there was always a indicator for the distance from airports. And, obviously, in a real world scenario, we know that, there's not many issues that happen around airports. So that has been removed. For other risk areas, such as railways, highways, waterways, etc., instead of having hard numbers, it is now more based on potential risk that you might be exposed to for a particular location. And the same is for bulletproofing. Yeah, this was a hard requirement in the past where you need to have a bulletproof security counter at level 3. That has been removed as well. In the sense that it is now based on the local threat assessment, because every country has different threat levels when it comes to people carrying guns. So that has been honored now as well. There are some other things indicated. TA is heavily pushing towards that data center location should be chosen in such a way that it helps with you being able to achieve sustainability. So obviously areas where you could have free cooling, etc., would be highly desirable. And there has been some exception made as well for the floor loading for the somewhat smaller setups. And this could be very handy when we talk, for example, about entrance rooms or very, very small computer rooms. And another thing that has been removed, which I think is very welcomed by the industry, is the importance factor for architectural design. In the previous versions of the 942, there were always discussions around importance factors. Basically, importance factors make the building, let's say, stronger than what is required. So it puts an extra level of requirements on the building. Now, in itself, of course, fantastic, because we know that buildings are very critical, right? Data center buildings, but it has a huge cost impact. So a small factor increase on the importance could literally mean another 30% in construction cost. And of course, one has to consider whether that was really worth it. So that has been removed now. But of course, data center designers are free to still apply an importance factor if they are in critical zones. For the building construction, we have also expanded it. So now we have added 1A and 1B type of buildings. As you know, the indicators typically relate to the type of construction the building has, from wood or steel construction, etc., as well as the application of potentially fire, sensitive type of material. The fire resistance also has been simplified. In the old days, we had 4 hours for external walls and 2 hours for internal walls for rated 4. That has been moved down to 2 hours for external and 1 hour for internal. Again, it's a great cost saving for something that typically would not be exposed to this type of risk. In terms of the security, there has been a lot of clarification because in the previous versions, there was not a lot of good description, I would say, in terms of how security typically is implemented in a data center. Yeah, it was more related to what we would say entrance into a building. But we know that obviously data centers are built in a much more secure environment with perimeter walls, security guard houses, etc. So there has been some extra clarification done now on the zoning for the various security layers typically used in a data center, including the bulletproofing. As I said, it's now based on what potentially is the threat in a local area. So, for example, in the US, where it is, in that sense, a little bit easier to get access to a gun, you might have still the requirement for bulletproofing. Whereas in country, for example, like Singapore, where you can't own a gun, there it will be a bit more lenient for you to implement security in a different way. The other thing that has been accomplished is that the security systems, so we talk about the VSS systems, etc., they can now be powered up by the general backup power. In the previous versions, we talked about 8-hour backup on the system, so you had to have a separate backup system, power backup system for the security. This was not always appreciated because people typically connected to the main backup power environment anyway. So that has been removed now. So if you connect to the main backup power, you don't need a separate system again. Again, great cost savings without having an impact on the overall setup. Frame rate. It was always 20 FPS, frames per second. Now you can get away with 10 frames per second. Of course, it's an option. Yeah, you can still keep it at 20. This is again, a great saving, because especially nowadays where we have so many cameras, putting recording in at 20 FPS, could lead to a lot of data. So by reducing it to 10 FPS, and some EX systems actually have the ability that if there is a fast movement, that it automatically switches up to 20 FPS. Yeah, you could always implement it in that way. But the minimum is now 10 FPS. Some extra work has been done on the refueling panels. In the old days, there was not really a proper description. But of course, we know that this is quite a vulnerable point in most of the data center setups. So now it has been clearly described that it needs to be a secure setup. And for rated 3 and rated 4, we would like to have the addition of the video surveillance system. Loading dock, another contentious point. We normally had at a minimum 2 loading docks for rated 4, but that has been reduced now to a single loading dock, which obviously saves a lot of money. There's also no requirement anymore for the separation of visitors and employee car parking. In the old days, there was a clear separation requirement for those two. Now, basically, the car park could be a common car park, but there are, of course, requirements to make it separated from the actual data center wall. There should be appropriate checks in place to make sure that, obviously, nobody can do something funny when they drive in with the car. And in most cases, the recommendation is to have the cars outside of the building. For rated 4, now there's a strict requirement that the UPS and battery needs to be separated. In the previous version, you could combine it in one room, but for rated 4, rated 3, you can still do it, but rated 4, you need to change it and separate those two. In terms of the mechanical, as you know, the S-Ray has come out with an extra new guideline accommodating, for example, high density H1 class. We know that this is a little bit of a difficult definition, because H1 class is not really defined by S-Ray in terms of what it is. So it is basically up to the vendors to declare their service in this particular class. But overall, the band in which you can operate has now been opened up a bit. We used to only allow A1 to A2, but now you're basically allowed from A1 all the way up to A4. Now, of course, this is based on the traditional equipment, the air-cooled equipment. But if you go for immersion cooling, then you might, basically accommodate the cooling based on the vendor specification. So then you don't have to specifically be within this band, because the requirements are often quite different. One thing that has been introduced is the corrosion testing. We call it always coupon testing. This is basically to detect any contamination in the air, like hydrogen sulfide, etc. Now, why was this introduced? Well, with the widening of the band for temperature and humidity, there is a higher impact when there is corrosive, contamination in the air. So as a result, it is now required to do testing for that. The air conditioning. In the traditional setup, we always said that you need to have at least one extra air conditioner for every 5 or 8 units. This was based on the N+1 principle. Now, this is not always required, we know, from a practical point of view. It all depends a bit on the setup. So the TIA has now said you can actually do whatever you want, so to speak, as long as you can prove that your setup is still able to meet the concurrent maintainability or the fault tolerance requirement. So typically what we as auditors would expect is that you show us computational fluid dynamics analysis, where you can show that even though you might not have a 1:8 or 1:5 ratio, that you still can maintain appropriate cooling environment even with a +1 failure. In terms of the sprinklers, we have now made it more generic. We call it not only sprinklers but also discharge nozzle. This, of course, to accommodate the water-based type of system, but also the gas-based type system. The rated 2 data centers do not require early warning smoke detection, because in fact, unless it's required by code, of course, that's always the case. And the reason is that we basically thought that a rated 2 data center is not so mission critical. So to pass on some cost savings, we decided to take this out if the customer doesn't want it to install. Liquid detection, that was another one. It was compulsory basically for the computer rooms and the entrance rooms. Entrance rooms are basically the telco over handover points. But now what we have determined that we say, okay, what is the actual risk of liquid? Why does it need to be detected if there is no adjacent area which could pose a risk, or if there is no active equipment? Yeah, so now it's based again a little bit more on the risk analysis principle, where we look at adjacent area. If there is a risk of water ingress or any other liquid ingress, then you have to install liquid leak detection. But if that is not the case, then you're free to not install it. In terms of the mechanical section, there is also now a informative table which addresses some of the requirements that you could consider for liquid cooling, in this case, immersion cooling. This section is going to be released for sure in the next year or 2 years as new technologies come in. It will be a much more better description how to go about phase 1 cooling, 2-phase cooling, including cold plate cooling. So you can expect some changes. And normally what TIA does is that there is an informative section being updated. Normally there will be an annex released specifically only for that section. So that might come in the next year or two. Another very welcome change has been the diesel, or the fuel supply as we call it now. In the old days, the requirements were pretty hefty, especially if you go for rated 3, rated 4. We talked about 72 or 96 hours, obviously, dependent on whether the local authority would allow that. Now it has changed to 12 hours for the rated 1 and rated 2 environments. And for rated 3 and rated 4, it is basically now 24 hours. So that is much, much more practical. Of course, we need to make sure that we have, appropriate top-up levels, on standby. Therefore, for rated 3 and rated 4, you are required to have a bulk fuel supply agreement with a 6-hour response. Yeah, and that should come from at least 2 providers. And normally, what we as auditors would look at is who are those 2 providers, because if they buy from the same provider again, then obviously there is still an element of risk. So we typically would like to see where the 2 sources are coming from. Another part that has changed for the mechanical system is for rated 1 and rated 2, that you must have at least a bulk tank. And that is only when the runtime that is required, which basically is 12 hours, exceeds that of the day tank. Now, in some cases, the day tank is capable enough to handle more than 12 hours. In that case, you do not need a bulk tank. For rated 3, rated 4, well, you can imagine there is no day tank that can handle 24 hours typically. So there you will very quickly end up in having a bulk tank. And normally we would like to have 2 bulk tanks there to make sure that if you lose 1 bulk tank, you can at least still maintain the minimum requirement of 24 hours. And since we are so reliant on the fuel, we need to make sure that for rated 3 and rated 4, that the supply for that is based on dual pathways. In terms of the fuel supply, nowadays we're not talking just about diesel anymore, and that was one of the reasons why we now talk about power standby systems rather than generators, because you might have hydrogen, you might have other type of fuel supply as well. So basically in the TIA now there has been made a distinction between the liquid fuel supply, which is typically the diesel style, or gaseous-based fuel supply like hydrogen or other or gas-based natural gas type of scenarios. And again, in the standard, given that we're also very concerned about safety, there is some discussions implemented around the gas detection as well as the various redundancy requirements. In terms of electrical, as I said, there is a change in the sense that we now talk about the backup power systems. There was sometimes confusion about what type of generators was required. And that had to do with the TIA that sometimes we talk about a standby power generator, and sometimes we talked about self-generation. And it was not always clear for customers how that was supposed to be implemented. So what is now being done is that the generator, call it types, is basically referencing the ISO standard, which clearly defines 4 types of generators, that being the standby one, the prime, limited time running, and the continuous power. So obviously for the traditional application where the utilities are designed as per TA and the backup power is purely as backup, then we could get away with having the emergency standby power rated system. But if you lack, some of the requirements for the utility supply, then you will end up in what we call the self-generation clause, and then we move towards the continuous power type of setup. In terms of the backup generator, as I said, we call it backup power system now to accommodate other forms of backup power. Nowadays, we're not just talking about gas turbines or diesel generators, but also about large-scale hydrogen fuel cell, flux capacitors, battery energy storage systems, etc. So even micronuclear grids are, coming up now in the various discussions. So TIA is ready to accommodate this type of setup for your new designs. In terms of the recommendation for the electrical systems rated 2 is that redundancy and isolation for fuel storage. And basically, normally in rated 2 you can get away with 1 tank, but the recommendation is there to make 2 tanks. Okay. The generator for rated 4. This was always a very, very heavy point for most data standards that implemented rated 4 because the original TIA-942 was talking about an N plus N, or you can call it a 2N type of setup. So technically speaking, if you would have, for example, 10 megawatt on each leg, A and B, then technically speaking, you would have 10 meg of generators on one side and 10 meg on generators on the other side. And that's, of course, an incredible costly configuration. So now what is allowed is to have a distributed type of environment where you have an N plus 1 capacity in a distributed type of redundancy setup, feeding both A and B. Of course, you have to be very careful how you design it, and that requires some clever thinking. But now you can work with an N plus 1, so that leads to great cost savings. For rated 3, we move from single bus to multiple bus configuration. For the main utility board, we normally had a requirement that says all the breakers have to be draw out. That has been changed now to accommodate that some of the smaller data centers who might be still very critical, like rated 3 or rated 4, to get away with having non-draw out breakers. And again, that is typically for the smaller ratings where we talk about 400 amps or below. Additional safety measures have been implemented in TA with regards to the distribution boards, where now there is a requirement for certain form factors. And for those of you not so in the electrical space, form factors typically indicate how an electrical distribution board is designed. So form factor 1 will be one open board, so to speak, or one closed board, where all the components, including terminations, are all in a single compartment. Whereas in the highest level, form factor 4B, every component, including each of the terminations, have its own little compartment. And of course, if there's a flashover, etc., that will be not impacting then other compartments and therefore a better redundancy design. So for rated 3 and rated 4, the requirement is now to go for a form factor of 3B, which means that breakers have to be in their own compartments, but the termination points might be in a shared compartment. In terms of the surge suppression, that is now, it was always already required for rated 3 and rated 4 on the main distribution board, but we now have implemented that also on rated 2. The neutral isolated light fixtures, this was really something that is kind of like US-centric only because of the way electrical systems in the US are designed. The rest of the world, this was not really appropriate, so that has been removed. And lightning protection is now based on the local code and of course also on the local risk analysis, because frankly speaking, lightning protection is quite different in various type of countries. So rather than specifying the NFPA NEC, it's now based on the local code. Another very good option in the electrical system is based on the redundancy. In the good old days, it was always A and B. And in some cases, people would implement n+1 on each leg, which is actually not required. You can work on an n+n configuration. But now, since most data centers are getting larger and larger, yeah, we see that people start doing more clever designs. One of them is what we call a catcher system. You can see that on this chart on the left-hand side, where we basically have an A and a B UPS, and there is a catcher UPS. In this chart, it's indicated with UPS-C. In case one of the UPSs fail, then the catcher system UPS will provide still UPS-powered output to that UPS. So, for example, if UPS A will switch to the bypass, that bypass is now not raw power, but it's coming from another conditioned power source, being the UPS-C. Other things that we see in the data centers now, where we're going into larger power ratings, where simply n+n is not always workable anymore. And it's also not very efficient, because we can basically run a maximum of about 50%, so to speak, on each leg. So what we see now is that there is more clever distribution designed, where you have multiple UPSs feeding the floor. It is a little bit more complex from a wiring point of view, but it could help you to drive up the efficiency and the utilization of the UPS. So in this case, what we design for is what we call a 4 makes 3 type of configuration, whereas one UPS fails, that load that that particular UPS was carrying is now divided over the surviving UPS. Again, from a wiring and setup perspective, it's a little bit more complicated, of course, than the traditional A and B, but it can help with better utilization of the equipment. And again, the TIA standard does now allow you to do so. The other thing that we have implemented in this version of the standard is that we now also allow for different types than just the traditional static UPSs. We allow now also for rotary and hybrid technology. So that is, of course, based on the newer technologies that we see in the market. Traditionally, rated 3, rated 4, we also needed to separate the rectifier input from the static bypass input. You can still do that. It's still a preferred option, but now it's also allowed to have the rectifier and the static bypass, so the two breakers that you see in the bottom of the drawing, to be combined in a single breaker. And again, for smaller data center setup, this would not be a big deal. But as you go in larger ratings, breakers at a very high rating could be very, very costly, and in fact also space occupying. In terms of the batteries, we normally talked about certain battery time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, etc. That has basically been removed. So now the overarching statement is that your backup system must be able to run through the time that it takes from utility down till your standby power systems basically come online. So that could literally be 1-2 minutes if you want to design for that way. Of course, most people still prefer to go at least 5 minutes, but you're free now to basically design for purely a ride-through type of environment. The battery life, also, we don't have a requirement anymore for a 10-year minimum design life for rated 3, rated 4. You can now stick with 5 years if you wish to do so. And the monitoring has changed from string to bank level. That's more a technical editorial type of scenario rather than a big change from a monitoring point of view. The viewing, in the old days, we always said you need to have a viewing glass. That is only required now for certain risk areas where we have, for example, flooded cells or lithium ion. But you don't necessarily need to have a P glass anymore. You can also now basically use, of course, the VSS type of solution. Shutdown for the load bank. This was a requirement, and that stems from the risk that if you're doing a test, and if during the load bank test your utility might fail, the risk could be that your load bank is already loading up the data center. Utility fails, now the extra load comes on, and then you basically trip the breakers. So now basically the shutdown is removed. You don't need it anymore. You can do it in an isolated way. For cooling pumps, and this of course relates to the immersion cooling. There is now a requirement to have UPS backup on that one. And that's, of course, very, very important, because if you have a write-through on the generator, let's say, it takes a minute for your generator combination to go online, it could literally have a huge impact in high-density immersion cooling tanks. So now there is a requirement to cater for continuous power provided by a backup. And the EPO, now we have included a statement that says that where permitted, for the cover guard, because in the old statement it says the EPO needs to have a cover guard, but that was actually contradicting some of the regulations in certain countries, where certain countries say that the EPO must always be uncovered just because it's an emergency button. It should be very easy to be reached. Now, the data center people on this call know that the EPO button is quite a scary button because there is no wait time. If you push the button, it's all down. So most people still probably go for the cover guard if that is permitted by the local regulation. So those were some of the changes. Now, I would highly advise you, obviously, to look at the 942C when it is going to be released, because the devil is always in the details, as they say. So that's why you have to be very careful. I just gave you a bit of a spin on the high-level changes. So in terms of certification, you know that there is an official accredited certification scheme. TIA is the only standard in the world that has an official certification accredited scheme for the certification of this particular standard. And that applies to data centers, to container and prefab style, to modular data centers, as well as to products. So for the traditional data centers, we normally have two offerings there, the DCDV and DCCC. The DCDV relates to the design documents of the data center. So this is typically a stage where you're going to build a data center, you start making your shop drawings, etc., and you get that validated against the 942, or maybe if you do a renovation product. Once then the data center is up and running, then we would go for the DCCC, which is actually an assessment of the constructed facility. TIA-942 ready, that's the certification that pertains to container and prefabricated structures. The modular is based on the MDCS, the modular data center, and we have also product certification, but this applies only to certain products. So you can think about active components like cooling equipment, generator equipment, UPS systems, etc., etc. So those are some of the certifications available. Now, obviously, when you do certification, you have to be very, very careful, because unfortunately, in this world, there are a lot of Pinocchio, so to speak. So people that make you believe that they can actually help you with certification. So be very, very careful. Ask yourself a few questions. First of all, is the organization that is claiming to be able to do an audit, are they authorized by TA? Very important. Ask for a confirming letter. Then the next question is that particular organization a true certification body? And what is a true certification body? That is an organization that performs audit and is accredited under the standard ISO 17021, because that standard will make sure that the organization has the proper structure in place, well-defined processes, have the right resources to do the audits. Of course, honor the confidentiality of all, because of course, when we do an audit, there will be a lot of details that are very, very confidential to the organization. Impartiality, make sure that there's a proper complaint and appeals in case you are not, in agreement with the auditor. And of course, quality needs to be monitored and measured. So that is all defined in the ISO 17021. So very important. And of course, make sure that you choose an organization that has been there and done that. Experience in data center auditing is very, very critical to be able to do proper auditing. Now, let's say that you have already a data center that is certified, and it could be for 942B or maybe even an older version. So what can you do? Technically speaking, you can maintain your 942B or earlier versions of the standard certification if you wish to do so. Okay. The other option is that you upgrade to the 942-C. Of course, it has not been released yet, but when it has been released, when it will be released, then you can consider to move your existing certification up to 942-C to show the world that you are obviously compliant to the latest version. A few options. You can do it at the surveillance stage, you can do it at the recertification audit stage, or in some cases, there might be organizations that say, I want to do it immediately. Of course, that is possible. So contact your local EPI office to get, or partner, to get more information about the options available for you. If you're going to design a new data center project, then it will be very good to start using the 942-C. Although we can imagine that that is not always possible. You might be already halfway through a project and you are working with the 942-B, or that was your design basis. Again, no issue. You can continue. You don't have to move. Although you might want to consider it, because as you have seen, some of the requirements that were quite strict in 942-B, for example, the fuel supply, car park security systems, have somewhat softened to some has been fine-tuned to local setups, etc. So you might want to consider to look at 942-C anyway, so that you can migrate immediately to the latest and greatest version of the TIA. If you want to know more about the TIA-942 itself, this is the training framework that we have at EPI here, covering design, build, operations, risk, and standards compliance. And obviously, for the TIA, we're looking at this particular section of our training framework. The most popular course, CTDC, the Certified TIA-942 Design Consultant. Again, if you have already a certificate, you have done the CTDC in the past, normally your cert will have an indication whether it was done when there was the 942A or the TIA-942-B version, as the then current version of the standard. You can maintain it, of course, because there is no expiry on that cert. It is basically tied to the version of the standard. But if you wish, you can do an upgrade to the latest version, again, the 942-C. What are your options if you want to upgrade? The first option is to attend the classes that we will conduct based on the 942-C. And we have some good news for you, because if you have already a CTDC certificate, or you might have a certificate being the ATD, ATS, or ATP. Those are certifications based on the uptime tier guideline. Then we have an offer for you, whereby if your cert was issued in 2021 or prior to that, you get automatically 10% discount. If you were issued a cert in 2022, you get 25. And if you were done last year or even in this year, you'll get 50% discount. And that will apply to the virtual classes and in-house classes that we might perform for you. It includes, of course, the student workbook, which is upgraded to the 942-C, the exam, and it will also include standard, the 942-C. And that in itself is already a value of $653. That's the current version, the 942-B. We think it's going to be maintained, but there might be a price increase. We don't know yet. So it's all included, so all packaged. However, we're only going to run this discount levels for selected schedules. The schedules are here on the chart. We're covering, of course, the Asia Pacific region, USA, the European, Middle East, and Africa market, and the Latin American market. So these are the dates for which this discount scheme is available. There is also another option for those of you who prefer self-study. That can only be done if you have a CTDC. So this does not apply for ATD, ATP, and ATS. There is a certification self-study if you're not available to go to the class. It's a fixed price of US $18.95. And again, that includes the standard itself as well, which again is $653 at this time. However, if you have an existing CTDC certificate, whether that is an A, a B, then we are able to offer it to you at a discounted price of only $1,200. That will be valid 3 months from the release date of the TA. So if the 942-C is being released, what we expected in April, then 3 months from the release date, you are able to apply for this great offer for self-study. And with that, we have come to the end of the official part of the presentation, and we open the floor for the Q&A.
Great, thanks for that, Edward. We've had a ton of questions come through, so thank you to everyone who's sent questions through. We'll try and get through as many as we can. If there's any that we don't, look, please feel free to contact us afterwards too. It will be difficult to get through these all. So what I'll do is, Edward, I'll start running through them and then I'll just hand them over to you. One of the questions from Arshad was, will our certificate be changed to version C after a successful surveillance audit?
Okay, if you do a surveillance audit, then we will maintain the then current version of your cert, which, for example, if you have 942B, then the surveillance will be based on the 942B. Now, if you desire to go to 942C, then you will need to inform the account manager to say, we wish to upgrade at that time. And that means it's kind of like a recertification. So what will happen then? We'll obviously spend a little bit more time on the surveillance to make sure that all the requirements of 942C are implemented. And then you will get a new cert. So that means you get a new cert. That means you have another coverage for the next 3 years.
Great. Rommel Dansel has asked, are diesel fuel polishing systems mandated by TIA?
There is well, it's not mandated. There is a statement around fuel quality, and of course nowadays that applies to the various types of fuel quality. So yes, that is part. The fuel quality needs to be maintained as per the vendor specification.
Another question from Mohammed Javid. He's asked regarding the UPS catcher system and the electrical changes. Is it just good to have it, or is there any impact on the rating level as well?
No, in terms of the rating level, there is no impact. So it's more I would say a more efficient design principle because it allows you to have a large setup with less equipment, so to speak, especially when in some of the environments that we have seen in countries where the incoming power supply is not really that fantastic. The risk is always that the UPS might go to bypass, and that basically means you're running on raw utility power for that particular leg, and that is very undesirable in most of the environments. So there are two solutions. In some cases, what we've seen is that folks basically disable the static bypass functionality. Now, yes, you can do that, but that means that if you have, for example, an inverter fault on the UPS, you basically drop the load. And then, of course, you hope that everything swings from A to B on your IT equipment. But that could potentially be slightly risky because there is a huge jump that goes from A to B or vice versa. So what most people prefer is that the UPS goes to static bypass. Now, if the utility power is of nice quality, not a big deal. But if it's a bit risky, that is where people typically start looking at a catcher system, so that at least if the UPS goes to bypass, you still have clean computer grade power. So it is possible now, both for rated 3 and rated 4, to have that particular setup.
Great. Wang Nguyen has asked, he says that he sees the fuel backup has been reduced from 96 to 24 hours for rated 4, but what about the water backup for cooling towers?
Very good question. Very good question. So the water backup for cooling towers is aligned with the diesel requirements or the backup power requirements. So if you have 24 hours in a specification for the backup power system, your water needs to be having a backup equal to that portion. So basically, it will be 12 hours for rated 1 or 2 and 24 hours for rated 3 and 4.
Excellent. So Sarah Zahidi, she's asked the question, does the updated standard look at the fire detection suppression recommendations for lithium-ion batteries, or will that still be subject to the local codes?
It's basically subject to local codes. So basically, TIA does not specifically say what type of system you need. So it only talks about sprinkler, pre-action, or gaseous-based system. Now, what gas you use, whether that's Novec or whether it's FM200 or Inogen, that is up to your decision. And of course, you need to match that with the fire hazard area. So as rightfully indicated, the traditional SLA type of environment, FM200 Novec and all that was perfectly okay. But now with lithium, you have a higher thermal runaway temperature, so you need to consider that one. And you cannot just get away with FM200 anymore. And that's one of the risks that we see in some of the environments where data centers say, oh, we're going to change our battery technology from SLA to, for example, lithium ion. And then they forget to take into consideration the existing fire suppression. So although TA is not specifically saying if you have lithium ion, then this is the recommended, or if you have SLA battery, this is the recommendation. It's always based on your own risk assessment and as per the local code.
Mode Hizrullah has asked, when is the 942C actually going to be effective from?
Okay, well, basically effective from the date of release. So the technical committee, we were together in about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So there it was approved. And then what TIA has to do, it has to brush up the document, make it official in terms of the front page, back page, and the whole lot. It will be then submitted to NC, which is all done, and the outcome is expected somewhere end of March or first week of April. So once NC says everything is in good shape, then TA within the following couple of days will release it into the market. So as it stands now, expect somewhere in first, second week of April. That's the current knowledge that we have. But again, it depends on NC and how they go through their assessment.
Yeah. Sanjay Halim has actually asked, when will EPI be able to offer design validations and construction certifications based on the 942-C standard?
Right. Technically, we can do it now. Because despite that the standard is not officially released in the market yet, we of course because we are part of the technical committee, we know exactly how it's going to look like. We have all the requirements already. So if somebody says I would like to go for 942-C, then let your account manager or the partner EPI know that that is your desired level of the 942, and then we can take that into account already in current projects.
Saeed Nizam has asked, kindly explain how modular DC certifications differ from the design validation and construction certification.
Okay.
For that matter, for a traditional data center with containment and modular in nature. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think if you look at say the modular type of setup, right? Basically, if we do a traditional data center, we look of course at various aspects in terms of the building, the access to the building, fire suppression, and all these other aspects that are there, right? Like entrance rooms, etc. For modular data centers, which is let's say a prefab or a container, there are certain things excluded, right? A container doesn't have an entrance room, right? That is an external part. So what we do in that certification, we basically look at the container itself, look at the container plus everything that is inside, look at the connection points. So for example, if you say I have a rated 4 container, well, we know we must have 2 connection points for cooling, for power, for telecommunications. So we will assess all those requirements. That will be then certified. That doesn't mean that if you take that container and plunk it somewhere in the middle of a city, that suddenly now you have a rated 4 type of environment, right? Because you need to make sure that all the external requirements of TA are also satisfied. So yes, you can have a container with 2 power inputs, but if you only run 1 wire, then of course you don't take the advantages of what a container can offer at that level. And then it would still maybe be even a rated 1 environment. Yeah. So, but the only thing what we do with that specification that we say the product itself, the container, will meet the requirement of rated 4 as long as it's put in an appropriate and connected into an appropriate environment.
We've had a question from Essa Katjanen. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Hi, is there a mapping available with how TIA-942-C matches aligns with ISO 27001, particularly the security standard?
Okay, now 27001 is an IT management security framework which touches not only on say the data center part, but also on other matters in terms of data security. There is no one-on-one mapping. Because the 27001 is much more broader from a security point of view than TA. TA only focuses on physical security. It does not touch on data security. So there is, this it's quite a difference, I would say.
Right. Next question is, if you have the CTDC, what do you need to get to the next level, which is to be an auditor?
Okay. Well, in terms of auditing, there are 2 levels. You have what we call an internal auditor. This is typically a person that will prepare their own organization to be ready for an external audit that is conducted by a registered certification body, like EPI. There is a lead auditor's course. However, be aware that the lead auditor's course does not mean that you can be an auditor and issue certification, because the requirement for auditors is that you are, employed by a registered certification body, and then only that registered certification body can apply for certification by TA. So the way it would work is that a lead auditor goes to the site, does the assessment, the certification body is assessing the report, give recommendation for certification to TA, TA might validate that, and then TA is the one that issued the certificate. So as a certified lead auditor, you cannot say I do an assessment and I print a certificate myself. That will not be, accepted by TA.
That actually segues into a question from Tabiso Kobe. He's asked, what is the route for being the true certification body? What are the requirements?
It's well, it's very heavy. So yes, I don't have gray hair, but it's a lot of requirements because first of all, the organization needs to be fully compliant to ISO 17021, and that is not a small feat. You need to have a lot of processes in place. For example, you need to have an impartial committee, you have an oversight committee, you have a certification approver. So it's you need a decent sized organization to be able to comply to 17021, and you must have very, very strict processes in place. Obviously, that is the first step, and then from there you will still need to have the data center expertise, etc. So it's not easy. It's not something that you can very quickly do.
We had a question from Tariq. Will today's session slide be available? Yes, we'll be making it available to everyone after the presentation. We've reached the hour mark. I think we've still got quite a lot of questions. So Edward, if you're happy to, we can go for perhaps another 10 minutes and get through a few more questions.
Sure, yeah.
And then I think what we'll do after that, we'll round up. And then please, as I mentioned earlier, if you've got any other questions that we haven't got to, feel free to get hold of us and we'll assist you. One of the questions is from Jesada. He said, now my data center is under process for design review for the TIA-942 design, both design and facility. He wants to know for version B or C, will EPR give him a certificate? Okay, so he's going through a design review process right now for version B. Obviously, with C coming, how does that affect his certification application?
Well, basically, if we are currently working on it based on the B version, then that is what will be done for the design perspective. Of course, we can always look at potentially upgraded to C. There might be a fee involved because obviously we need to reassess the whole document set again based on the 942C requirements. Another option is, of course, to say, okay, we have a design document for B, and then at the time of the assessment for DCCC, so the construction certification, then we move it to C. As I said, most of the requirements are a little bit softened, so typically it should not be a problem. There are some requirements that are stringent, right? For example, rated 4, we have to do more separation of, for example, the UPS and battery room. So if you go through B now and you would like to consider C, then contact your account manager, ask them for a potential assessment on C as well, and then we can have a look at that one.
This has been a question that a few people have raised. They want to know if it's mandatory to upgrade from TIA-942B to C, or can they continue with their B forever?
You basically can continue with B. So if you're happy with the B version and you don't want to move to C, then you don't have to. What I typically would recommend, to some of the customers that have asked me before as well, say, why don't you, basically assess on C? Then if it appears that C is not attainable because of your old the design that you had made already many, many years, then you might say, then we stick with B. Because you know that you will comply to B. But if it is possible, you move to C. If not, you stick with B. But if you say, well, I don't care about C, right? I'm happy with B, you will be able to continue purely with the B certification. And that is, of course, both for the data centers as well as for example, the CTDC certificate. However, be aware that when you end up in consulting engagements and the customer says, well, I'm going to design for 942C, and you have a CTDC certificate for 942-B, the customer might not be willing to give you the consulting job because they might say, well, you're not familiar with the latest version. Even though you might have the version in your hand and you read it, but customers sometimes are very particular that the certification of an individual has to match the actual project requirements.
We've got a question from Saeed Ali. He's asked, what impact does this have on the certified data center professional and the certified data center specialist based on the new certificate?
Yeah, good question. Obviously, in those courses, there are elements of the 942. Not all, of course, because we also address many other standards in that particular training course. But the ones that are impacted by 942C, that will be revised in the new versions of the CDCP and CDCS, which will be also coming in the next few months. So currently, we're very heavily upgrading all the material to make sure they're fully aligned with the latest version of the 942.
Rowan Peck had a question. He said, for pathway separation, for example, fuel, what's the minimum separation distance or barrier requirement?
Okay, there is no hard requirement in terms of distance for fuel. Typically, in TA, normally when we talk about separation of path, we try to achieve 20 meters, so 60 feet. However, the statement says, it should be as big as feasible, or something along those lines. I don't know the exact statement out of my head, but basically we say it needs to be, as much as separated as physically we could. But if you have, for example, and that's just what we've seen in some of the occasions where it says the entrance room has to be, for example, 20 meters separation. Some people get very worried, right? They say my entrance rooms are only 50 meters separated. Now I will not comply. Well, that's not true. Yeah, from an auditing perspective, I think it's very important to mention. When we do an audit, we have what we call CAT 1 and CAT 2. CAT 1 is a major non-conformity, and CAT 2 is a minor non-conformity. Now, what is typically a major non-conformity? That will be something that basically hinders the outcome objective. For example, you need to be concurrent maintainable. Now, if we find something in your electrical distribution that will not make it concurrent maintainable, that's a major violation of the standard, and we call that a CAT 1. You will not get your certificate. You need to fix it. Now, if there is something that you have done which might not fully comply, but it's not an impact on the outcome, then it could be a CAT 2, a minor non-conformity, and you could be okay. So, for example, at the entrance room, 20 meter separation. Let's say you have 50 meter. Then we look at what is the risk. Is the risk of fire moving over from one compartment to another? If there is not, then we would consider it to be a minor non-conformity, and because there's no impact on the outcome, and you still can get certified. And again, just to emphasize, we get a lot of questions from customers always about, oh, if I cannot meet this, cannot meet that, will I then not get a cert? Again, we have major and minor. Yeah, so as long as you have minors, it will not hinder the certification. So don't be always concerned when you read the 942-C, because I always say some people read the document like a lawyer, and if you read it like a lawyer, no data center in the world can comply, right? So, but if you read it as an auditor, where you look from a risk-based type of perspective, where you look and say, is there any potential risk impact for the resiliency and operation of the data center? And if that is not there, then we don't consider it a major issue.
Ibrahim Kamash had two back-to-back questions. He wanted to know if the Cat6 UTP cables and 600mm racks are still accepted. And then he also followed that by saying, is it required to get the design certification before the construction certification?
Okay, well, in terms of the CAT cable, again, that is one of those requirements that TIA has put in, but it's not mandatory in the sense for running environment. So if you have, for example, a data center where you run CAT 5, just as an example, and everything is still running happily, there's no issues with network performance, etc. Again, it will be a minor non-conformity, no problem for certification. In terms of the design certification before the construction certification. Our recommendation obviously is always to do so, and the reason is very simple. Sometimes one breaker in the wrong location or a valve in the wrong location could literally mean that it's no longer fault tolerant or it's not concurrent maintainable. And especially if you look at, say, chilled water plants, I can tell you one valve in the wrong location can be an absolute nightmare, because sometimes you simply cannot fix it anymore after construction. So be very careful when you work with designers. They might say, oh, I have designed so many data centers in my life already. Yeah, trust me. First question I would always ask them, are you certified? And the data centers that you say you have designed as per TIA-942, did they receive a constructed facility certification? If the answer is no, go for design, because you don't want to risk that one item messes up the whole scenario.
Yeah.
So our argument is always go for design, then go for construction. Yeah, it is too silly to save a few dollars on the design validation and later end up having to break down walls or adding extra equipment and have to go back to the boss again, ask for money, because somebody's head is going to roll, right?
100%. Okay, I think we've pretty much reached the end of the time that's been allocated for the webinar. So look, firstly, Edward, thanks for providing the presentation today, and thank you to everyone who's attended today. There were a lot of questions that we didn't get through. We've made lists. Well, I've made a list of some. We'll reach out to you individually. We'll be in contact with you. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email us. We'll be more than happy to respond directly to you. And if you have any other questions, look, don't be shy. We're here to help. So Thank you to everyone today, and much appreciated, and hope you got a lot of value out of the presentation today. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.